This evening is a celebration of what I call designed leadership. Cornelia, you've been an absolute pioneer and leader and educator in all senses of the words, in so many ways, in terms of how you've used your design talents to really change our experience of landscape. I couldn't help but sit in the audience and as you were talking about the milestones, and I was thinking back to the Urban Landscape Task Force in 1992 when we were talking about nature in the city and starting to realize that we were losing it, that it was disappearing on us. So then some years later, in 2009, I was a bit involved in the Greenest City Action Plan for everybody wants to be the greenest city, which is a good aspiration. And today, I did check on my Twitter feed. The City of Vancouver and all of us citizens now own the Arbutus Corridor. And the city has a plan for it to be a greenway. So it's a real, I think, opportunity for us in many ways. So tonight we heard from Cornelia, compelling and powerful as usual. From James about, I love that rewilding concept. I'm going to ask you more about it. And Magnus to give us the real examples of what we can do. And I mean, we often look to Europe for leadership, and so it's wonderful that you're here to give us inspiration. So I'm now going to invite the panel to engage each other, and you eventually. The rules of the road are simple. I'll toss the questions out, and whoever wants to respond, I think each of you have one of these wonderful mics. Is it weird? Am I too close to it? No, it's okay, because I feel there's an echo, but anyway, not to worry. And so we'll do that for about 15 minutes of conversation amongst us, and then we will invite you to come up to these mics that are at the front of the room and pepper these our colleagues with questions and comments. So, knowing that Cornelia is a woman of action, and she wants action, I'm going to cut to the chase here. If each of you could propose one policy to either federal, provincial, local, doesn't matter what level of government, that you would recommend be implemented to really change the game around the city-nature connection, what would it be? So that's sort of part A. So what would that policy be? And what would be the incentives that you might put in place to actually urge all of us to support that policy? I'll leave it there. A few minutes to think. Magnus is going to go for it.
Yeah, I'm going to go for it. I would say the green space factor, of course, because that's what I've been working with in Stockholm. I would put the number higher though than 0.6. I would say, let's say 2.0 instead of 0.6, and that would make a big change, I would say, in the way we plan our cities, because then you really have to consider nature more than maybe more than humans, I would say. And yeah.
And how are you going to urge the powers that be, the politicians, the planners? How are you going to? What's the incentive to get there?
Something with money, I suppose, but I don't know how exactly. But you have to kind of prove to them that they could save money by doing this.
Yeah. So actually, it's really interesting that you would say that, because one of the things I've been thinking about is, maybe it's the influence of being at a business school. What's the business case for this? And you've all referred to ecological services. So do we have enough research now to really say there's a savings here around making these moves.
I don't think we have enough, and it could be dangerous to kind of put a price tag on nature, because then it would be so easy to buy and later destruct. So that should maybe be avoided as long as you can, to give it another value that's more worth than money, I would say. So.
Yeah, there's the example in my book. I was looking at the ecological services idea, which I do think is very important, but there is, as Magnus was saying, there's the danger of taking it too far. And there was this example of the honeybees in China, where at one point, because of pesticides and destruction of habitat and so on, honeybees disappeared from this one orcharding area in China. And unfortunately, people discovered it was actually more efficient economically to do the pollinating in the orchards by hand. So there was actually, in the end, no incentive to bring back the honeybees. And as long as labor was cheap, and as long as people were able to get up there, and people could work in tougher weather than the bees, and it became this really difficult kind of parable around ecosystem services and where we draw the line and say, look, we can't simply say, if we can do it on ecosystem services with this much dollar value, but we can do it even cheaper ourselves, then we should just abandon nature and replace it with human services. So yeah, there's risks down that road as well, and I agree with Magnus that we have to keep that bigger, more holistic perspective of nature top of mind.
Your policy?
My policy, to be honest, I think I would go towards education at every level and say ecological literacy. You know, I'd love to see a policy to develop to increase the average ecological literacy of all citizens, so that we have that opportunity to knowledgeably connect with the natural world and start to develop that worldview where, when we're looking at a space and what to do with it, we're not only thinking of the human being, we're thinking of the whole suite of species that might use that space.
Cornelia.
Well, I am already someplace else, and I'm thinking, yeah, and someplace else is that I wish in Vancouver we would develop something like Stockholm Port City. That is my wish. How it's going to be done, I haven't got a clue yet, but I know we need everyone aboard to come to the conclusion that we can't just have high rises without nature, that we have to live with public transportation, that we should live where we work and not always go hither and yon and plug the roads as we are doing today. And so I wish that we could find a piece of land here on which we could develop something like Stockholm Port City, where people live with nature, children can go to kindergarten and school, there is not a transportation problem, and if you want to go to town, you have a subway, you have a bus, you have a bicycle, you have your foot, and you can be downtown. So this is my aim for this panel.
So Cornelia, do you perchance have an idea of where this might be in the city of Vancouver? Are you going to tell us?
Oh yes, I've looked at, greedily I have looked at British properties that have 4,000 acres there near Horseshoe Bay, on the road to Horseshoe Bay. I have looked at some land over in Burnaby from the Duke of Westminster, and that wasn't so good either. But then I think there is something up for grabs near the end of Falls Creek. And I think that land is to be developed like a unit without high rises that has nature incorporated and is nearby the center of Vancouver, and you don't have to commute anymore.
So do you, just to get clear, do you mean like what I think we call the Falls Creek Flats, or we used to call it?
Yeah. There.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Ah, interesting, okay. So in listening to your responses, one of my questions is around what evidence are we missing to convince citizens, decision makers, that to move towards the policies that you're suggesting are essential? And I'm especially intrigued with your views on how much of that is what I would call big data, so quantitative, capturing the data that's floating around our world and the internet, or what one might call thick data, which, James, your observation of sitting at Trout Lake and the insights that come from a more ethnographic, behavioral insight perspective. What's the balance? Because I think we're really in a position right now of needing more evidence and of using those tools. So I'd be very curious about how we position this idea of the Falls Creek Flats and bring a research and evidence to the table.
Well, I thought about that.
Okay.
And
why am I not surprised?
How can we enlighten the powers to be to see that this kind of lifestyle is probably much more desirable than high rises? So I was going to load them all on a plane and take them to Stockholm, port city, and learn that this was once a brownfield, that the ecologists came and convinced that we could have greenery there. Wasn't that the beginning?
Right, yeah.
Yes. I listened very carefully all the time, because I was so lucky to have just been into Stockholm to see it all. And I am advertising that this is a lifestyle for the future. And then how do we convince people here is by going there and seeing how it is done and translating these ideas into our world. And so.
I don't have the answer, but let me give you my view at least. I think it's always good to have a combination of the top-down perspective and the bottom-up perspective. So it means that it has to be a balance between the two that you're suggesting. So perhaps a great way would be to do just like James did, for everyone to have this an hour of just observing nature and then combine that with the big data that's already existing. Like in Stockholm, we have the tools already, the biotope map, and they're monitoring everything almost in this geographic information system. So the knowledge is there, but you have to be convincing.
Yeah, and in terms of, I guess I'm wondering a little bit about the kind of evidence, because I think, well, the evidence of climate change is quite strong. The evidence that we have a biodiversity crisis is very strong. The evidence that we benefit in terms of our mental resilience from exposure to nature is very strong at this point. I think we're at the point with a lot of these things that what we maybe need to start seeing are those little pilot projects and so on. And it makes me think of the local food movement and how, as that emerged in the city, it was really driven forward by a whole bunch of different people in the city who just started doing stuff, like guerrilla gardening and community gardeners and people going back and farmers going back and planting coastal varieties of wheat that hadn't been planted for 80 years, and people building community sustainable fisheries. And I mean, all of these things just started to happen, and as usual, I guess the politicians were then chasing afterwards. And maybe we need to do a similar sort of thing with the rewilding of cities, is just see people start to play with the city a little bit.
That sounds like a very sensible approach, to say just let's do it. I'd like to return to the theme of education, because I think what you're all saying is about awareness, is about how do we slow down in a world that is speeding us up all the time. So that's sort of one side of it. The other side of it, though, is how do we utilize the digital world to our advantage? There's got to be a way. I mean, we're not going to go back. So how do we use that world to teach, to improve ecological literacy? Are there things that we aren't yet doing that we need to be doing around that education realm and at whatever stage?
I think we are not doing enough of it. We have little clusters where it's being done, but the great understanding of climate change and how we fit into this world has not yet taken place. And so we look for people who have had experience in it, and we look into schools to teach differently. And I think if we could use what some of us know, if that could be more used, then maybe we get there. Mm-hmm.
Thinking of when I was working on the Bear 71 project, which was about grizzly bears trying to exist in this sort of increasingly digital world in Banff National Park. They're dealing with all forms of modernity, really, that big animals have to deal with: road traffic, train traffic, cellular, wireless. They're tracked, all of these sorts of things. And when I first looked at it, I thought, well, this is a horrible thing. But then I talked to a grizzly expert in Banff, and he said, well, in the past, when grizzlies approached Banff, people would just say, well, that's going to be a problem bear. It's dangerous. It for some reason wants to be near people. We'll kill it, and that's what they did. But through bear tracking, they started to realize that the bears were coming into Banff, and they were using the city limits and the suburbs and so on very carefully, and were actually getting very deeply into the city without causing any problems at all. And we're spending much more time around people with no problems than people were anticipating. And then they've discovered that they were all female bears. So what was happening is that female bears need protection from male bears, so they were using the presence of humans to shelter themselves.
Amazing.
And what the result of this has been that they now know, okay, these female bears are coming in, they're sheltering, they value the presence of humans, they're cautious about their interactions with them. There have been no conflicts between these female bears and the residents of Banff, and so they've stopped killing the bears. So this is a case of what I think of as intercultural learning between humans and another species. And I think we're just starting to think about other species as other cultures that we can interact with. And that's certainly the kind of area where digital science can be fantastically useful.
Magnus?
Yeah, I don't know, but sometimes I walk around the streets and try to practice this landscape thinking by looking at materials that I see and try to figure out where they come from. And sometimes, I don't know, so I have to use the digital world to figure it out. And just the other day, I looked at my phone and say, how can this be a landscape? And I went on the internet and found out that there's a big problem with that, because some parts of the batteries are mined in Africa and they have horrible conditions then. And yeah, through the digital world I could find that out and So that could be an exercise that everybody could do, you know, just learning to trace where stuff comes from.
So each of us as researchers into improving our own understanding.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, I think it's time for you to ask questions, make comments. So I invite you to come up to these mics that are at the front of the room, and ideally introduce yourself so we know who's asking the question, and come on down.